The topic and question at hand for today's frequently asked question, that wasn't meant to be emphasizing frequently. I just think I missaid frequently the first time.
Yeah, you tried twice.
Yeah. How long can you actually float for?
That's the topic of today?
That's the topic of today. How long can you actually float for? This gets asked quite often because even though we have 1 hour sessions generally throughout the day at Modern Gravity, we also have opportunities for people to float for 90 minutes. And they're like, whoa, that's crazy. I thought an hour was long enough. And we have a whole nother video that talks about lengths of floats. But 90 minutes, that's even more nuts. And then we go, yeah, and there's some people who even book back-to-back floats. So they go in for like 3+ hours. And at that point, they're like, whoa, that's even more crazy and insane.
You know what else they say?
What do they say?
They say, does it cost something different? Or is there a different price?
Yeah.
They usually ask that. And then what do we say?
Oh, for the 90 minutes.
Versus the 60s.
Versus 60s. No, it doesn't. But anyways, super common question. And to go into some fun details, no, there's really theoretically not any limits that you have when it comes to floating. Obviously there's cost and just your general time, like you don't have time just to pick, I'm just gonna go for 6, 7, 8 hour float this afternoon, which people have absolutely done. Again, it's hard not to go into any more depth of that because a lot of people who do that are going to have issues with pain and pain management, and that's end up why they go in for longer periods of time, or if we're just trying to get explorative. My own personal experience is I've actually been in a float tank. This one we actually had it at the house for over 12 hours, and that was a pretty sweet experience. It's again, like when people ask like, why did you do it? And it's completely based on just seeing how far I could go into a float. Like in terms of benefits, I find after a couple hours, I'm getting like 80-90%, or 80 to 90% of like what I need from a float tank.
You're going into psychonaut mode.
Yeah, that's more like the explorative because I don't have any major chronic pain, so I'm not going in for that long just to kind of reduce pain for that period of time.
Or I think as the kids call it nowadays, sicko mode.
I was gonna make a joke about pretending not to understand that, but I actually haven't heard that before. Is that a thing?
Sicko mode?
Sicko mode?
It's a song. You ever heard Sicko Mode by Travis Scott and Drake?
Well, I'm sure you've played it.
I've played it
called Sicko Mode.
Thousands of times.
Then like you play it now and I'll probably be like, oh,
we can't
I didn't know it's
copyright.
called Sicko Mode. Anyways.
Now you know.
Yeah, I floated over 12 hours. It was really just based on seeing what I could do in my own mind, like psychonaut mode, or just, exploring my consciousness and seeing after all those years of floating if it's something that I could do.
Sounds like a future storytime video as well. Just want to point that out.
It is. That's a good point. We've also had a customer who completely obliterated that number and went in for 24 hours, which that in itself is another storytime video that maybe we can actually just bring that person in to talk about it.
Or that other series that we don't have a name for yet.
Yeah, which we will eventually come up for.
Real People, Not Actors.
Real People, Not Actors. Modern Gravity's podcast, talking with customers. She happened to go in for 24 hours, which again, there's a lot of different questions people have surrounding that, like how do you even do that? What if you need to pee? What if you need to eat? What if you need to do all those things? And we will cover all of those in a separate video. But basically, the importance with this question at hand is, yes, it's possible. You're not gonna die. Everything's fine. It's like when you go to sleep at night, you go for longer periods of time. Yeah, it's 100% possible. One of the big questions that people have, aside from being bored, like people are worried about like, how long can you actually float for? Like before you need to get out of the tank or you just go crazy or you get bored or whatever happens. And I would say that one is most easily addressed with the fact that we sleep 6 to 8+ hours a night, and this is much more associated with sleep than it is with staying awake, staring at a wall, or just doing daily activities, which can feel a lot longer. So with a bit of training, going in for even 2, 3, 4 hours for just the average individual is totally possible with enough practice and a strong mindset. The bigger point though that we get asked, because the board question happens with 1 hour floats, let alone 12-hour floats. If you go in for several hours, if you go in for 1 hour, 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, won't you come out looking like a prune. Won't you be all wrinkly and your fingers just be completely like looking weird, right?
That's an aesthetic for some, so that's kind of weird.
I don't think that's true, but that does not happen in float tanks. You could go in for 1 hour, you could go in for 12 hours, and your hands will look exactly like they did before you went in.
Now that's what I call an advantage.
And it's crazy. I would like to say it's magic, but it's more or less predicated on science. And when I say more or less, it just is. And the reason being is when you go into a pool or this is again, we'll do a whole different video just on water.
One day.
But when you go into filtered water, such as in a pool, or filtered water, such as your bath water, when you're laying in a bathtub, there's a whole lot of minerals inside your body, and there's not a whole lot of minerals outside of your body in the filtered water. And so through the power of osmosis, you can have like quite a bit of transference, and then you can get some kind of wrinkly fingers, and we're not going to go too deep into the science of it. When you go into a float tank, because of such a high concentration, your body doesn't need anything from it, and the water doesn't need anything from you. If you were hopefully trying to be a prune, you're not going to be one when you get out. Anything else to add to that point?
Not at all.
Yeah. Next point. We kind of covered this all already. I just had a note here. It's like, will I go insane? No, you'll just probably get bored, or your body's going to tell you, and your mind's going to tell you that you're ready to get out. And that's why I mentioned earlier, it can sometimes come down to a little bit of just practicing floating. No, you're not going to go crazy. You're not going to go insane. Your body is quite good at telling you, I should say your mind and body are quite good at telling you when it's time to get out. And it doesn't really have any limit on how long you can actually float for. So the next thing I'm about to say is complete, as they may say, bro science, or just random anecdotal experience that we pretend to be evidence when it's really not. Let's say you're just starting way up here, you're like super awake, you drove here, you've been alert, you had coffee in the morning, you worked your whole day, now you come in to float. You could be just coasting up here for the first 10-15 minutes of your float, and then you'll just drop down super quick. So imagine you're just floating on the surface of the lake, you'll drop down really quick to the bottom of the lake, and at that point you'll touch the bottom, and then you'll come flying right back up to the surface. And think of that as like a solid hour to 90-minute float. So a good hour to an hour and a half float. You just dip down really quick, come back up, and you're like, whoa, I feel nice and refreshed on that one. When you're doing longer floats, you have to be able to shorten that time down, so you're not just dipping down, touching, and coming right back up. Because the minute you come right back up to the surface, that's when your mind and body are going to be telling you, okay, cool, you feel relaxed, rejuvenated, it's time to get out, go on with the rest of your day. So for me, I was meditating quite often, like meditating once or twice a day, just in the mornings and evenings, not for any crazy amount of time, but just as keeping a consistent practice. When I went into a float tank, I was quite aware of when I started to dip down, and instead of dipping straight down to the bottom and coming flying right back up, I would just slow that process down by meditating and focus on my breathing and all that kind of fun stuff. Meditation can be quite helpful for when you're actually doing longer floats, but again, the topic of this video is, yes, it's possible. Just throwing a little insight on how it's possible.
I see.
You have any last thoughts? You have anything you want to add?
So what you're saying is that it doesn't really matter if you float for long or short periods of time. Most people tend to float for short periods of time because not everybody has like 25 hours.
And also too, it's like
25 hours, not 24. You know, why use a full day when you can go an hour over?
You can go over. You can now say you floated for more than one day. But you summarize it right. It's like, how long can you actually float for? You can float for longer periods of time without any type of health concerns, right? Or major health concerns. Obviously, when you're floating and you may have issues, always ask your doctor. But for the most part, there's nothing that we can foresee that would stop somebody from floating for long periods of time. And there's no problem being in salt water like that for longer periods of time.
And frequency. That's a point that I hear about. How many times can I float in a week?
We can just dive into this part quick because I think it is important. It's kind of like how long can you actually float and how often can you float? Yeah. That's actually how those questions get asked. You could float for an hour every day. And to be honest with you, I would rather see somebody float once a day for an hour versus floating one or two times for 12 hours.
It's like the effects don't compound if you go on for over like
that's a really good question.
3-4 hours. And I've gone for like 3 hours plus and they're great, right? But like by the time you're up to like 5, 6, 7 hours, you know, there might not be that extra
it's
thing.
diminishing returns, right? Like, again, that's why
Unless more kind of weird stuff happens in the tank at different periods.
But again, it's
flow.
happening to be explorative.
One's not necessarily better than the other.
No, it's not.
It's just they're two kind of different things.
Yeah, for very specific purposes. For the average person and why they're trying to come in and float, you're going to be getting like, 80% or more, 80, 90% of the results in that hour to 2 hours. After that, from hour 2, or we'll even say 3 hours, I think up to 3 hours, you get a lot of the benefits. And then from hour 3, to using the example of me floating for 12 hours, from hour 3 to hour 12, that's just the remaining like 10 to 20% of the kind of benefits that are happening. But again, on a interesting curve, you then get the enhanced point of like exploring. My comments or feedback is, sure, you absolutely could float for 2, 3, 4 hours, 3 or 4 times a week, but could you not maybe float 1 hour, 2 hours once a week or twice a week maybe, and then reinvest that time and additional money you would be spending floating here and invest it into some other area of your life that you would better benefit and be able to enhance.
Before this video gets half an hour long, are you good for a summary?
I think you summarized it really well. Is how long can you float, and is there any like limits or dangers? Short answer, no. There's no issues with you physically being in concentrated salt water for that long. You're not going to become wrinkly. You're not going to turn into the hashtag prune life. You're going to be completely fine. And in terms of the emotional or psychological parts of things, worst case scenario, if you try to do a longer float, you're just going to get bored and want to get out. You're going to feel a little stir crazy and just want to move your bod. And if you did want to go in for longer, then you just float shorter times more regularly and maybe get a bit of a meditation practice. Is there any, like the other summary part is this, like how long can you actually float for? Like, are there any limits? No. Is there any major benefits from floating, like for crazy amounts of time? Not really, unless we're starting to get into more of the explorative nature of things. But yeah, that's kind of the big piece of that loaded question. We have a lot of loaded questions around here. And here on our FAQ, What the Fact is Floating videos, we like to unpack things for you.
All right.
So that's all that I got for this video.
Well, then finalize it, please.
If you have any follow-up questions that you have specifically for this, because like we mentioned maybe 17,000 times in this video, we have a lot of other videos that we can make specifically going into each of the other pieces. But if you had any kind of follow-up questions, throw them in the comments. If you had any other questions that you have just about floating in general, throw them in the comments. And yeah, we'll see you next time.
Cool, man. Goodbye.
Bye. I feel like as a kid, I always wanted to be a MTV, what do they call them?
VJ?
VJ? That's not true. I just felt like that would be funny to say. Where they hold the cards, and I wonder if they actually had things written on them.
I thought you were going to say wildebeest, but...
I mean, who doesn't want to be a wildebeest?